I was working for a company in Charlotte. I handled social media accounts for small businesses, and since a lot of the work could be done from my laptop, my schedule was flexible enough that I could work a couple of days remotely if I planned ahead. My boyfriend Joe worked too. His schedule was a lot more rigid than mine, but he'd managed to save enough vacation time that we started talking about taking a short trip before summer got too busy. We preferred renting houses because we'd cook breakfast ourselves, buy groceries, and just relax. We ended up finding a rental house on the coast near Emerald Isle. It wasn't directly on the beach, but there was just a narrow stretch of dunes between the backyard and the sand. The house itself looked older in the listing photos, built decades earlier than a lot of the newer vacation rentals around it. It had been remodeled inside, though. The floors were newer, the kitchen had updated appliances, and there was a screened porch overlooking the dunes. It was quieter than staying closer to the main public beach access points. There weren't many neighboring houses, which probably wasn't as appealing to most people, but I thought it was. It took around 6 hours with stops. The owner had left one of those printed welcome packets on the kitchen counter, explaining where the extra towels were, how to lock the sliding doors, the garbage pickup days, the Wi-Fi password, and things like that. We unpacked. I claimed the dresser closest to the bathroom. Joe immediately opened every window because he liked the ocean air, even when the air conditioner was working perfectly fine. We grilled burgers on the back deck and watched people walking farther down the shoreline with their dogs. After dinner, we cleaned up, watched part of a baseball game, and once the sun started setting, decided to walk on the beach. That was something we'd always done whenever we stayed near the coast. Night beaches feel different from daytime ones. During the day, they're loud with families, kids, coolers, umbrellas, and people playing music. Once it gets dark, most of that disappears. It wasn't late. Around 9:30, there were still scattered groups walking around. Some people had flashlights. Joe had taken his shoes off immediately because he hated getting sand inside them. So I carried mine too. We were talking about work because even on vacation, that's what people end up doing for the first day or two. We'd walked farther than we realized. The houses behind us looked different from the one we'd rented. We turned around and started heading back. That's when another couple approached us. They looked like they were probably around our age. The woman had blonde hair tied back and wore a sweatshirt. The man was a few inches shorter than Joe. They smiled before they even reached us. The woman was the first one to speak. She asked if we were staying nearby. I didn't think much of it because people make small talk on vacation. I pointed generally behind us and said we'd rented a place for a few days. She smiled wider and asked if we'd like to join them. I thought she meant maybe they were having a bonfire or something. I asked, "Join what?" She looked over at the man before answering. "It's kind of a community," she said. Joe asked what she meant. The man finally spoke. He said they were part of a local group that helped people find better ways to live. That didn't really answer anything. The woman jumped back in before either of us could respond. She said if they introduced enough new people to the community, they received money, like she was talking about a referral bonus at work. Joe politely smiled and said, "I think we're okay." I said, "Thanks, but we're just in town for the weekend." The man gave a quick wave, and then they simply walked farther down the beach. Joe watched them for a few seconds. He asked, "What do you think that was?" "My first thought was church," I said. He laughed. "My first thought was a pyramid scheme." We talked about it for a few minutes, mostly making jokes about ending up in some beachfront self-improvement seminar. By the time we reached our rental, we'd already stopped thinking about them. Back inside, Joe locked the front door. I checked my email while he took a shower. Then I showered after him, because I couldn't stand going to bed covered in sunscreen and salt water. Around 11 o'clock, we were both lying in bed. We just talked. Those conversations always ended up wandering from one topic to another. We talked about moving someday, whether we'd want kids, whether his parents would ever leave Ohio. The bedroom window was open. I think that's one reason the next sound confused me. It sounded like something heavy forcing wood that wasn't supposed to move. Joe stopped talking in the middle of a sentence. He looked toward the bedroom door. I asked, "What was that?" He tilted his head and said, "Did somebody just..." Before he finished, we heard another dull cracking sound. The back of the house. Joe got out of bed. I followed a couple of steps behind him into the hallway. The back door was at the far end of the room. The door wasn't open all the way. It looked crooked, like it wasn't sitting correctly in the frame. Joe said, "What happened to the door?" The door pushed inward another few inches, enough for someone to step through. The person who entered wasn't anybody we recognized. He was much taller than the couple we'd met on the beach. He wore a mask, dark clothing, and carried a wooden club or something like it. We were on vacation in a place we'd been staying for less than a day, and there was a masked man walking through the back door like he'd been expecting us. Joe yelled, "Get out!" The man didn't say a word. "Get out of the house!" He kept coming forward with that stick in his right hand, like he'd decided what he was going to do before he came through the door. I remember Joe stepping in front of me. The man was wearing gloves. The screen had been ripped open. Joe grabbed one of the dining chairs and lifted it. I don't think he planned to fight anyone. It was simply the closest thing he could get between us and the guy. The man raised the club and swung it. Joe caught part of the blow with the chair, but it still made a loud crack against the wood. I screamed. I wasn't expecting it to happen that quickly. Joe shoved the chair forward, trying to create some space between them. The masked man stumbled backward one step, but came forward again. I grabbed another dining chair that was pushed under the table and tried to pull it toward us. The guy changed direction. Instead of swinging at Joe again, he turned toward me. I barely got the chair up before he hit it. The force of the blow knocked the chair sideways, and the second swing caught my left forearm. I was already moving and dropped the chair immediately. My arm just felt numb. Joe shoved the man as hard as he could. The two of them crashed into the side of the dining table, and the guy almost lost his balance. Joe yelled, "Run!" He backed away from the man while keeping the chair between them. I got the deadbolt unlocked. By the time I had the door open, Joe was already backing toward me. The masked man took another swing that hit the wall near the hallway instead of Joe. He had misjudged the distance. Joe came through the doorway. I grabbed his shirt and pulled. We both ran into the front yard. After we got outside, I saw him standing just inside the doorway. He looked toward us, then disappeared back inside the house. Joe grabbed my hand and kept pulling me toward the road. We didn't know the area well enough to know where the nearest occupied house was, but we'd passed a small seafood restaurant on the drive in. It couldn't have been more than a 5-minute walk away. We ran there. My arm had started throbbing, and I could feel it swelling underneath my sleeve. Joe kept asking if I could move my fingers. I could. That was about all I knew. The restaurant was still open because it was summer, and they stayed open later for tourists. When we came through the front door, I don't think anyone understood what had happened. We were barefoot. Joe's shirt had a tear near the shoulder. I was crying. The employees asked if we'd been in a car accident. Joe said, "Somebody broke into our rental." An ambulance checked my arm. Thankfully, nothing was broken. The club had hit mostly muscle instead of bone, but I had a deep bruise that spread from my elbow to my wrist over the next few days. The officers drove us back to the rental after making sure whoever had broken in wasn't still inside. The back door was splintered. Nothing had been taken. An officer asked if we recognized the person. We both said no. Joe mentioned the couple we'd met on the beach. He explained the conversation word for word. The woman had blonde hair. The man was shorter than Joe. Neither of them wore masks. Neither of them seemed aggressive. The person who came into the house wasn't short. He was a few inches taller than Joe, who was exactly 6 feet tall. Even if the man on the beach had somehow changed clothes, put on a mask, and come back later, the height difference didn't make sense. The woman obviously wasn't the masked person either. Could there have been someone else with them? We never saw anyone else. Could the couple on the beach have simply distracted us earlier to figure out where we were staying? We never told them the address. All I said was that we were staying nearby. There were dozens of rental houses in the area. If they had followed us from a distance after the conversation, I guess they could have figured out which one was ours. But why? They didn't ask us anything personal. They didn't try to keep us talking. We cut the trip short. We drove back to Charlotte the next morning. If the people on the beach had been pushy, threatening, or obviously trying to lure us somewhere, I'd think the answer was obvious. But they were polite. They accepted no immediately. They walked away without looking back. The masked man never spoke a single word. Those two things don't seem to belong in the same story, but they happened less than 3 hours apart. It sounded so unusual. If we bring new people, we get money. I've searched more than once to see if some organization around the North Carolina coast used that kind of recruitment, and I never found anything that matched what she described. One night was enough to permanently change what a relaxing vacation means for both of us. I lived in Western Kentucky for a little under a year when this happened. I had moved there because of work. I was 24 at the time and had gotten a better position with a supply company that handled equipment for hospitals across Western Kentucky and Southern Illinois. Every now and then, I'd have to drive out to warehouses or clinics to count equipment. Since I didn't know anybody in the area, I ended up renting a duplex with one of my co-workers, Lucy. We'd only known each other for a couple of months before deciding to split the rent, which sounds risky. But it worked out surprisingly well. We had opposite schedules most days. She worked earlier than I did, so she'd usually leave before 7 in the morning, while I'd get up around 8 and drive to work around 9. The landlord had clearly replaced things only when they broke. We liked living there. The rent was affordable, the neighborhood stayed quiet, and we were both busy enough that we just wanted somewhere to sleep. Most evenings, we'd make dinner together unless one of us picked something up on the way home. I spent weekends unpacking boxes I'd ignored during the move. Lucy decorated way faster than I did. She had pictures on the walls after 2 days, while I still had dishes sitting inside moving boxes. Nearly 2 weeks later, I started noticing the house behind ours. The backyards weren't fenced. It sat farther back than the other houses and had a lot more trees around it. It looked neglected. Nobody mowed the lawn very often, and there were always leaves piled around the porch. Nobody ever explained anything. It became one of these weird local subjects where people knew something, but also clearly didn't want to be the person telling the story. Our landlord simply said, "Bad things happened there years ago." That was all. Neither of us spent much time thinking about it. Empty houses exist everywhere. People die. Families move away. Crimes happen. There are a lot of reasons a house can develop a reputation. The place didn't bother me. I got used to seeing it. Every morning, about a week after moving in, Lucy had already left for work, and I was making breakfast before getting ready. Somebody knocked on the back door. I unlocked it. There was a woman standing a few yards away in the grass. She wasn't close enough that I thought she intended to walk inside. She was just looking at me. She wasn't close enough for me to notice details like wrinkles or anything. She had shoulder-length dark hair and wore what looked like a gray shirt. I asked if she needed help. No answer. She didn't even seem confused. She just kept looking at me. You know those interactions where you start wondering if someone can hear you? I thought she might have hearing problems. Or maybe English wasn't her first language. I stepped out onto the little concrete patio and asked one more time if she was looking for somebody. Nothing. She never moved. I backed inside and figured I'd grab my phone so I could call Lucy and ask if she'd ever seen anyone like that around the neighborhood before. I walked through the house to grab my phone from the living room. I wasn't gone long. When I came back, the woman was gone. The yards behind our duplex were completely open. You could see across them without much obstruction. There wasn't anybody walking away in either direction. There wasn't anywhere someone could have disappeared unless they'd gone toward the old house behind ours. That was really the only direction with enough trees to hide someone quickly. I texted Lucy about it. When she got home that evening, we stood in the backyard trying to figure out where the woman could have gone. Lucy pointed toward the old property and said, "Maybe someone finally moved in." That made the most sense. Lucy had relatives visiting over the weekend, so the house stayed louder than normal, with people coming over for dinner. 4 or 5 days later, Lucy was working late. I got home around 6:30 and went into my bedroom. While I was sitting there, I heard a sound outside. I can't really describe it. Whenever someone asks what it sounded like, I always end up making comparisons that don't quite fit. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't machinery. It wasn't yelling. It sounded like more than one noise happening at the same time, blending together into something I'd never heard before. It wasn't especially loud. What made me stop was how unfamiliar it was. I stood up and looked out my bedroom window toward the backyard. Nothing outside matched whatever I just heard. I stayed by the window. Then I felt something wrapped tightly around me from behind. It felt like both arms closing around my chest. I couldn't pull in a full breath. I thought someone had gotten inside the house. I tried turning around, but I couldn't. It felt like all the pressure was centered around my ribs and upper arms, like someone much stronger than me had grabbed me in a bear hug. The harder I tried to breathe, the tighter my chest seemed to get. I remember trying to yell Lucy's name. Hardly any sound came out. I managed to stumble forward, and then my knees gave out. I was crawling. I remember being on the floor, trying to get into the hallway because, for some reason, My brain had convinced me that if I could just get out of my bedroom, I'd be okay. I don't know why I thought that. I reached the hallway. My arms were shaking. I could barely support myself. I screamed. Lucy had gotten home. She told me afterward that she heard me screaming before she'd even gotten her key out of the lock. She found me halfway into the hallway, on my hands and knees. I was trying to breathe, but every breath felt shallow, like my chest had completely locked up. I was more focused on trying to get air than talking. She thought I was having a panic attack. I remember one of the paramedics asking if I had asthma, if I'd ever fainted before, or if I'd taken any medication that day. By the time we got to the hospital, my breathing had improved enough that I could answer questions normally. They ran what felt like every basic test they could think of. They checked my heart, took blood, monitored my oxygen levels, and kept asking whether I'd been under unusual stress recently. I wasn't. Life had actually been going pretty well. I'd started a better job. I liked living with Lucy. I wasn't dealing with anything that stood out as stressful. The doctor told me that everything looked normal. I wish they'd found something because, at least then, there would have been an explanation. I was discharged. I explained the strange sound I'd heard before everything else happened. I compared it to machinery, wind through pipes, distant voices, electrical humming, and even animals. None of those descriptions were accurate. It wasn't any one of those things. She asked, "Did it actually feel like someone grabbed you?" I nodded. It felt like somebody standing behind me, wrapping both arms around my chest and squeezing. She looked toward my bedroom and said, "You're probably going to think this is stupid." She reminded me about the woman we'd seen. It's difficult to explain, but after that, my bedroom stopped feeling like my room. I had the constant feeling that someone else was already there, just present. Like walking into a room where another person had been sitting quietly only a moment before. I looked under the bed more times than I'd ever admit to anyone. One morning, Lucy came into the living room looking exhausted. She asked, "Were you walking around during the night?" I hadn't been. She said she'd woken up around 3 in the morning because she thought she'd heard someone slowly walking down the hallway. Then she realized I was still asleep. The only thing we knew about that old house was that there had been some kind of family tragedy there. Lucy and I started looking for another place to live. The strange thing is that everything stopped after we moved. I never felt that crushing sensation again. I never heard that impossible sound another time. More importantly, I never again had that persistent feeling that I was sharing my room with someone I couldn't see. Years have passed. Maybe I experienced some kind of medical episode that just happened to coincide with an unusually creepy situation. The woman standing in the backyard. When I came back, she was gone. The only direction she could have gone without crossing open ground was toward that abandoned house everyone avoided talking about. I've gone back and forth on whether she was even a real person. Some days I think she had to be. Other days, I remember how perfectly still she stood, how she never answered me, and how nobody else in the neighborhood ever mentioned seeing someone move into that property. Whatever happened during those weeks in Kentucky has stayed with me much longer than I ever expected it would. I don't spend much time trying to explain it. After we moved away, I never again felt like I was sharing a room with someone I couldn't see. And I never looked at another empty house quite the same way. I'm Gina. This happened a few years ago while I was driving from Georgia up toward Tennessee. I wasn't trying to make the whole drive in one day, because I hate being exhausted behind the wheel. I've always preferred splitting long drives into 2 days, if I can afford the extra night somewhere. It's less stressful, and I enjoy road trips more that way. I was one of those people who would pack my laptop just in case, even if I wasn't planning on working. It made me feel less guilty about taking little trips because I knew I could always catch up if something came up. I had been visiting one of my cousins outside Atlanta for a few days because she had just had her first baby. I love my cousin, but after 3 days, I was ready to get back home. I planned my route so I'd stop somewhere in eastern Tennessee for one night before finishing the drive the next day. Hotels around the interstate were surprisingly expensive that weekend because there was some kind of college football event nearby. So I started looking at Airbnb instead. I found a little cabin outside Gatlinburg. Calling it a cabin makes people picture something isolated way out in the woods. But it wasn't really like that. There were quite a few rental cabins scattered around the area. The listing had hundreds of good reviews. People mentioned family vacations, weekend getaways, and hiking trips. The pictures matched what I found when I got there too. I brought my overnight bag inside, walked through the cabin, and did what I always do in rentals. I checked that the doors locked, figured out how the thermostat worked, and looked around enough to know where everything was. I wasn't searching for hidden cameras or anything like that. This was before those stories became as common online. The internet worked, which made me happy because some rentals exaggerate that part. I answered a couple of work emails while sitting at the kitchen table, even though I technically wasn't working that day. Then I called my mom because she likes knowing where I am whenever I travel by myself. She reminded me to text her before I went to bed, and that was the end of the conversation. Around 6:30, I decided to take a short walk before it got dark. I wanted to stretch my legs after driving most of the day. The road the cabin was on looped around a hill with other rentals every so often. Some looked occupied, and some didn't. It didn't feel deserted at all. If anything, it felt like one of those vacation areas where everybody mostly keeps to themselves, but there's always someone nearby. The cabin next to mine had been empty when I arrived, but while I was walking back, I saw 2 SUVs pulling into the driveway. There were 8 or 9 people altogether, mostly around my age. They looked like they were starting a weekend trip together. I was smiling because they seemed excited. Everybody was unloading coolers, backpacks, grocery bags, and folding chairs while talking over each other. It reminded me of trips my friends and I used to take after college, before everyone got married or moved away. I wasn't annoyed by them. If anything, it made the area feel safer, knowing there were plenty of other people around. I figured they'd be loud for a while, grill dinner, maybe drink a little, and settle down eventually. That's pretty normal for vacation rentals. I went inside and made myself one of those frozen dinners. While it was cooking, I stood at the kitchen window, looking outside. I could hear laughter coming from next door. Every now and then, somebody would yell something I couldn't quite make out. It sounded like people having a good weekend. After I ate, I sat out on the porch. I liked sitting outside in unfamiliar places for a little while. It made me feel less like I was sleeping in somebody else's house. I saw someone walking up from the neighboring cabin. He was a tall guy. He had a beer bottle in one hand and walked with that slightly uneven pace people have after they've been drinking for a while. He slowed down near my porch and then stood there looking at me. After a few seconds, I smiled and said, "Can I help you?" He turned around without answering and walked back toward the group next door. I laughed to myself after he left. He definitely looked like he'd had a few drinks already. It was strange. I went inside instead of sitting outside any longer. I locked the front door. The noise from next door got a little louder over the next couple of hours, but it still wasn't anything outrageous. Music, people laughing. I could hear enough to know they were still outside, but not enough to understand what anybody was saying. Around 10 o'clock, I took a shower, changed into a t-shirt and shorts, and plugged my phone in beside the bed. I remember debating whether to watch another episode of a show I'd been binging or just go to sleep, because I wanted to leave early the next morning. I chose sleep. The last thing I remember before turning the lights off was hearing somebody next door yell something that made everyone else laugh. It sounded like a normal vacation night. I remember opening my eyes because I thought I heard people outside, and I assumed the group next door was still hanging around, drinking. The bedroom wasn't dark because there was a tall window along the side wall with the blinds only partly closed. Some light from the porch outside and another cabin farther away came through, enough that I could make out the room without turning on a lamp. I had just started reaching for my phone on the nightstand when I heard a hard thump against the side of the cabin. I figured somebody had stumbled into the wall. They'd been drinking for hours, and it didn't seem impossible that someone had walked in the wrong direction before. I barely had time to think about what it was. The window beside the bed slid open. I remember seeing two men climbing through the window at the same time. One came in first, and the other followed right behind him. I recognized both of them as being from the group staying next door. One of them was the same guy who had walked over and stared at me earlier that evening. I yelled. The first man grabbed my shoulders and shoved me backward onto the bed, while the other picked up a t-shirt that I'd thrown onto a chair after my shower. It had apparently gotten damp because I'd left it hanging over the bathroom door earlier, and he started twisting it like he was trying to make some kind of rope. Neither of them seemed like they were thinking clearly. They smelled strongly of alcohol, and they were talking over each other. One kept saying, "Just hold her," while the other laughed in a way that sounded more drunk than angry. I was kicking, yelling, and trying to push them away. I think I was just screaming as loudly as I could. One of them tried grabbing my wrists, but he couldn't get a good hold because I was pulling away and hitting at anything I could reach. People outside started yelling. I couldn't make out what anyone was saying, but I heard a woman's voice shouting, "What are you doing?" There were footsteps running toward the cabin from outside. The two guys looked toward the window they'd climbed through, and one of them said, "Go." They scrambled back out as quickly as they'd come in. I rolled off the other side of the bed, grabbed my phone, and ran toward the front door because I didn't know if they were coming around to the front or not. By the time I unlocked it, there were already a few people outside. Two women were standing on the porch, looking terrified. They asked, "Are you okay?" A couple more people from their group came running up behind them, and everybody started yelling at once. The two women came inside with me, while a few of the men from their group ran back toward their own cabin. I heard somebody screaming the names of the two guys who had come through my window. One woman kept apologizing, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. Within another minute, the rest of their friends came back with the two men. They weren't fighting them, but they were dragging them away from my cabin while yelling at them. One of the drunk guys kept insisting he hadn't done anything. He was slurring his words so badly that I couldn't even understand him. One of the men holding him looked furious. He turned toward me and kept saying, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." He explained that the two guys had been drinking since the afternoon and had gotten completely out of control. He said they were lifelong friends and that they had never done anything like this before. I remember looking at him and saying, "They climbed into my bedroom." He nodded. "I know. They tried to tie my hands. I know." He looked back toward the others before saying, "Please don't misunderstand me. What they did is completely wrong. We're taking them home first thing in the morning. We'll never speak to them again if we have to." Then he asked if I would consider not calling the police. I didn't answer. A couple of the others joined him. None of them tried to defend what had happened. They just kept apologizing. One woman started crying because she said she couldn't believe her friends had done something like that. They said they would personally pay for my stay somewhere else if I wanted to leave immediately. Looking back now, I wish I'd gone through with calling 911. At the time, I was exhausted, scared, and completely overwhelmed. I kept thinking that if these people were all friends, what would happen after the police showed up? Would they all suddenly change their stories? Would I have to stay there for hours? Would I have to keep seeing those two men? The only thing I wanted was to leave. I packed everything. Nobody tried to stop me from driving away. I finished the drive home feeling completely drained. I wasn't rescued because of some security system or because I managed to fight them off by myself. I was rescued because a few decent people happened to realize something wasn't right and decided to check. That trip changed the way I travel. Thankfully, nothing remotely similar has ever happened again.